So right now, you might be thinking, some of you might be thinking of giving up. But one thing that I would like to remind you is that you should never quit. Tandaan niyo itong poem na ito ni John Greenleaf Whittier. Rest if you must, but don't you quit. Kasi nandiyan na, malapit na. Ito yung goal nating pare-pareho, no? Alam ko lahat kayo gusto niyo mag-take ng bar at you want to pass the bar naturally. So, pag nakasama niyo yan si Madam, sure na yan. Kasi signing of the roll number and your name is already in the roll of attorney. One of our sponsors, I realized, ay Rex Bookstore pala. Di ko alam na Rex pala yung sponsor natin. So since 1997, I'm an author of Rex Bookstore. So I have 4 books in law published by Rex Bookstore. Ayan, Labor Laws, Public International Law, 2021 yan. At saka yung Constitutional Law 1, 2021 din yan. And then Constitutional Law 2. So, and then other books that I have na Rex ang publisher. Ayan, ang dami niyan. No? I'm thankful na Rex pala ang sponsor natin. Okay? So, for those who are interested to listen to other lectures, ayan, pwede kayong puntahin sa YouTube channel na yan. You can also visit this FB group. Anyway, our topic is political law. So that definition is provided already there. It's a branch of public law that deals with the organization and operation of the government. Now, my lecture this morning will be focusing on what is important. Kasi yung Pareto principle, di ba, 80-20. So, focus tayo doon sa 20% na napaka-importante. Yan yung constitutional law at saka international law. So, if we have adequate time as we go along with the discussion, I am bound to complete lecturing on all this coverage para hindi nyo ako masisi later on. Ayan. So, what is the importance of the Constitution? Well, it is known as the fundamental law of the land. That's the foundation of the nation. It creates or establishes the different branches of the government, distributes and limits the powers. Ano ang purpose? For the common good. Okay? Now, if you want to interpret the constitutional provision, it must be interpreted in the light of the history of the times and conditions by which the Constitution was promulgated. That is why if you look at our Constitution today, compare that to the constitutions in the past, our present Constitution is inclined towards protecting human rights. Regardless of what the other people are saying, this Constitution is pro-human rights. That's why the Human Rights Commission is created under the 1987 Constitution, particularly in Article 13. Why is that? You look at the history. 1986 was the year when the Filipinos revolted against an oppressive regime of Marcos. Yung tatay ha, hindi yung anak, yung tatay. Okay? Pero may kaibahan ba yan? I do not know. But I'm telling you history, no? History ito at hindi ito opinion, no? That the Constitution is a product of the times. We were freed from oppression, so people fearing that another dictatorial regime would come in, created a constitution that would prevent that from happening again. Okay? As regards self-executing and non-self-executing provision, in case of doubt, you interpret the provision as self-executing. Okay? And if there's any law or ordinance that runs counter with the Constitution, it must be stricken down for being unconstitutional. That's a doctrine of constitutional supremacy. Above any law or ordinance, we follow the Constitution. Why? Well, in other words, we are a government of laws and not of men. And the supreme law is the Constitution. So under our system, you have the state. How do you define the state? According to that Montevideo Convention, there are 4 elements of the state: the permanent population, territory, government, and capacity to enter into foreign relations. That is known as sovereignty. If you remove that, the state is no longer a state. That is why in this case of province of North Cotabato versus government of the Philippines, the BJE, Bangsamoro Juridical Entity, that's the precursor of BARM, was declared unconstitutional because BJE under the MOA, hindi Mall of Asia, the Memorandum of Agreement with the Philippine government, BJE can enter into foreign relations. And that is an aspect of sovereignty. And if you give BJE that authority, you are creating a state. That's why the Supreme Court declared that memorandum of agreement between the government and BJE to be unconstitutional. Now, the government is the agency that carries out the will of the state. There were bar exams in the past na tinatanong yung kaibahan ng parliamentary at presidential. So parliamentary government, the people cannot elect directly the members of the executive. The people would just elect the members of the legislative department, and the members of the legislative department from among themselves would elect who would comprise the executive department, and the executive, the prime minister for that matter, would select his cabinet members from the parliament. So there's a merger between the executive and the legislative. Whereas in a presidential form of government like our government, which arguably is copied from the United States of America, diba? The people elect directly and separately the members of the executive and the legislative department. That is why we have the so-called separation of powers, which we will discuss as we go along. Now, in case there are changes in government, the substitute government would inherit all the rights of the previous government. But as regards obligations, the new government can distinguish which obligation to pursue. At yun ang pinagtataka ng marami. Bakit si Cory Aquino, inaakusahan niya na may corruption yung panahon ni Marcos, inako niya lahat ng obligasyon ng gobyerno ni Marcos, pati yung mga foreign debts. Diba? Now, another element of government is sovereignty. In the case of Tañada versus Angara, the question was answered. Is sovereignty absolute? The answer is, traditionally, it is. But as a member of the family of nations, there are certain limitations on your sovereignty. One of them is the doctrine of incorporation, that we incorporate into our laws the generally accepted principles of international law, and they become part of the law of the land. You have Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which we will discuss later on. And when you enter into a treaty, one of the oldest and most fundamental rules in treaty is pacta sunt servanda. Ano ba yun? Literally means promises must be fulfilled. Huwag kang paasa. Kasi kung paasa ka, marami nagkakasakit ng UTI. Yung mga estudyante ko alam ito umibig tapos iniwan. Umasa tapos inindyan. Huwag kang paasa. Ano? So pumasok ka sa treaty, igalang mo yan. Kung ayaw mo, huwag kang pumasok dyan. Now, the state will continue existing as a state. Unless, or even if there are changes in the circumstances of the elements. Your population has decreased or increased. You have changed your government, replaced it with another. Your territories have been invaded by China or, di ba? For as long as these elements are present, particularly your sovereignty, you remain a state despite the changes. Now, according to your chairman, Justice Leonen, in that case of Provincial Bus Operators Association of the Philippines, our governmental structure rests on the principle of separation of powers. Diba? That's why you can see on your screens the three branches, and they have separate, distinct powers from each other. And there should be no encroachment. The legislative creates the law. The president approves it and implements the law. The judicial department interprets the law. There should be no overlapping of powers. Separation of power is not expressly provided in the Constitution, a separate article. But you can read the different parts of the Constitution and you'll see that in Article 6, you have the Legislative Department, Article 7, Executive, Article 8, Judicial. And what does that tell us? There are separate powers. Okay? Now, the President as the head of the executive branch is a co-equal branch with the judiciary under the Constitution. He might be the highest official of the land, but he has to respect the decisions and powers of the two other branches, the judiciary and the legislative department. That is why there are orders nowadays. No vaccination, no ride. Pag walang bakuna, ipinapa-aresto ng presidente. Would that be legal? I think, and I believe, that's illegal. Why? Until now, my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reality. Until now, Congress has not enacted a law requiring every one of us to be vaccinated. In the absence of a law, the president cannot implement it. Why? Rights will be affected. No vaccination, no ride. Ay, that is illegal po. If I may remind our implementers of policy, we have a law, Republic Act 11525, if I'm not mistaken. Under Section 12, vaccination card is not required to avail of any government service. The services of any government agency, hindi ito ipagkakait simply the person is not vaccinated. May batas ho tayo dyan. Ang wala tayong batas, yung magpabakuna ka. But do not get me wrong, hindi naman ho tayo anti-vax. In fact, vaccinated na tayo. But the problem is we have to respect the rights of others who do not believe the way we do. Democracy exists in the respect of the belief of different people. Okay? Now, kung ayaw mong igalang yung paniniwala ng iba, hindi demokrasya ang hanap mo. Just the same, even if there is separation of powers, we believe also in the check and balance. Right? They're not totally separate from each other. The powers of each branch is not unrestricted. They're not independent. Right? These are provided by our Constitution. The National Assembly, kasi matanda ng kaso ito, in our case today, Congress enacts a law. The President may sign the law or veto the law. That is checking and balancing. Right? The President appoints his officials. The Congress, through the Commission on this appointment, or Commission on Appointment, diba, will approve or reject the appointments made by the President. That is a check and balance to the power of the President. Okay? Now, there is also delegation of power. The Latin maxim that potestas delegata non delegare potest, what has been delegated can no longer be delegated. Why is that? You have to understand that the power of Congress, the inherent powers of the state are all lodged in Congress. We'll discuss that. These are delegated powers by the people. Dahil sabi natin, all sovereignty resides in the people. Okay? All powers emanate from us. So when we elected these delegates, we delegated to Congress those powers. Now, Congress can no longer delegate that. Parang sa opisina, inutusan ka ng boss mo dahil mas mataas ka pa ng konti, inutos mo rin. At yung may mas mababa pa sa kanya, inutusan niya rin. Ay, hindi po pwede yun. So this doctrine is based on the ethical principle that the delegated power constitutes not only a right but a duty to be performed. Inutusan ka na, huwag mo nang iutos sa iba. Aray. Diba? So, however, the growing complexity of modern life, sabi ni Justice Leonen, kailangan nating mag-delegate. Hindi pwedeng ikaw lahat ang gagawa niyan. Diba? Hindi po pwede yung micromanagement So you are just the supervisor. You supervise your people. You do not do it on your own. That is why we delegate. Okay? But there are exceptions on the principle that you cannot delegate. The Constitution itself in Article 6, Section 1, sabi dyan, legislative power reserved to the people through initiative and referendum. Hindi nila ibinigay lahat sa Kongreso. Now, although Congress has the power to legislate, that power may be delegated to the President, to the Executive Department during state of war or national emergency. But take note, there must be a law. In the absence of a law authorizing the President to exercise emergency powers, he cannot do that. The President cannot arrogate to himself the power to legislate. Executive nga siya, hindi siya legislator. Diba? No matter how powerful is the president, he cannot act, he cannot implement a policy if there is no law. Kaya lang, pasensya nyo ng presidente natin, masyadong padalos-dalos siguro, no? If that is a right term. Sabi niya, arestuhin ang mga hindi bakunado. Bawal po yun. Wala tayong batas eh. Marami nang aaway sa akin dyan dahil hindi daw ginagalang presidente. Hindi ho. Sinasabi lang natin ang katotohanan dahil ayon mismo sa mga naniniwala sa Biblia, Ebanghelyo, ayon kay San Juan. Chapter 8 verse 32, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. Kung ayaw nyo ng katotohanan, hindi kayo makalalaya. Good luck. Okay? Taxing power. Diba? That may be delegated to the president. However, again, there must be a law. I cannot overemphasize the fact that the president cannot exercise these powers in the absence of a law. Okay? Now, administrative agencies. It is a known fact that when Congress creates an administrative agency, magiging walang kwenta yung agency na yan if it is not delegated with certain authority to promulgate rules or yung rule-making power, which is quasi-legislative power, right? And to adjudicate, which is a quasi-judicial power. Eh walang kwenta yung administrative agency mo pagka walang ganyang delegated authority. Okay? And to the local government units. Walang kwenta ang local government kung wala itong power to make rules and regulations. Diba? Kasi siya mag-i-implement yan. In a previous bar exam, explain the completeness test and sufficient standards test. These are the tests for valid delegation. Sabi ni Justice Leonen, KMU versus Aquino, completeness of the statute making the delegation and the presence of a sufficient standard. Eh ano ba yung completeness test? Again, sabi ni Justice Leonen, to determine completeness, all of the terms and provisions of the law must leave nothing to the delegate except to implement. Hindi na siya pwedeng mag-isip pa, implement ko ba o hindi. Hindi mo pwedeng bigyan ng discretion yung implementor except how the law should be enforced. Okay? Now, what about sufficient standards? In other jurisprudence, it is called a roadmap. The boundary, the limitations on the law to determine how far could that delegate implement the law. Otherwise, if he acted beyond the powers delegated to him, that would be an ultra vires or illegal act. Okay? It may not be illegal, but ultra vires, beyond the powers. Okay? That's why I remember Republic Act 7722 created the Commission on Higher Education. There was a time that there were anomalies in the board examination, board exam, PRC. So, CHED issued a memorandum intending to regulate the operation of the different review centers of the country. Okay? Now, the Review Centers Association of the Philippines filed a petition. And the court said in the 2007 Recap versus Ermita, you can look for that jurisprudence, that the power granted by law under Republic Act 7722 to the Commission on Higher Error does not include the power to regulate review centers. So if the law does not provide for that, CHED, as the delegate, cannot implement it. Walang basehan eh. Diba? And both these tests must be present. Otherwise, the delegated power is improper. It is illegal. Okay? Now, despite the fact that they are separate, they check each other, these branches They blend, a mingling of powers among the three branches of the government. That's not a novel concept. O noon pa yan, 1927, before you and I were born. The blending of powers has become necessary to properly address the complexities brought about Rapidly developing society. Imagine, 1927, almost 100 years ago. O rapid na raw yung development. Ano tawag nyo ngayon? So how do we see? And what are the manifestations of blending of powers? Congress enacts the bill, the President approves it or vetoes it. The President prepares the budget, Congress enacts an appropriation law pursuant to the prepared budget. Okay? The President enters into a treaty with foreign countries, the Senate ratifies the same with a vote of 2/3 of its members. The Supreme Court, however, may declare the treaty invalid for being violative of our Constitution. So yan ang blending of powers. Ano? So no less than your chairman said, in that case that we cited earlier, that under our constitutional order, the legislative branch enacts the law. Executive branch implements the law. The judiciary construes the law. In reality, however, hindi talaga sila totally separated as strictly confined or delineated to each branch. Nag-o-overlap talaga kaya tawag natin blending of powers. Now, among the inherent powers of the state is police power. Police power is the most comprehensive, least limitable, all-encompassing of all the powers of the state. It may regulate rights and liberty for the common good. Diba? So even morals may be the subject of regulation. However, police power is exercised by Congress, by the legislature. Walang inherent powers ang other branches. It is Congress. Okay? So, however, just like what we studied before, Congress may delegate such power. Now, police power is plenary. Iba po yung power of the police sa police power. Pagka naman ganyan ang mga police mo, di masaya. Ano? Police power is plenary. So it can regulate anything. Bakit? Yung pong salus populi et suprema lex is the principle behind police power. The state can regulate rights and liberty for the promotion of the common good. Now, what are the elements of police power, therefore? First, it is an imposition of restraint upon your liberty or property. And second, the power is exercised for the benefit of the common good, not only for a few people, but for all. In other words, there must be lawful subject. Okay? So not only the interest of a particular class, but the interest of the public in general. And you have lawful subject, you must have lawful means of implementing it. Diba? Kasi if the means employed are unconstitutional, then it would be invalid. Diba? So, we are in a democracy. The end does not justify the means. Kaya nakakalungkot kapag ka mga abogado mismo ang lumalabag sa prinsipyong ito na in their desire to have law and order, to have peace and order, they would violate or trample upon the constitutional rights of others. Remember, in a democracy, the majority wins. But democracy does not disregard the right of the minority. Okay? Now, police power of the local government units is not inherent. It is delegated and exercised through the legislative bodies of the local government units. In other words, sanggunian. So how does the sanggunian exercise police power? By enacting an ordinance. So, how do we know whether or not the ordinance is valid? In that case of Legazpi versus Cebu City, there are tests of a valid ordinance. Nanggaling naman ito dun sa Municipality of Berac, Tatel versus Municipality of Berac, Catanduanes. That is the recent one. The ordinance must not contravene the Constitution or any law. It must not be unfair. Puro negative, Dapat it must be fair. It must be impartial. It must not prohibit, but it may regulate trade. It must be general and consistent with public policy and must be reasonable. Okay? Now, applying all of this, can we say that MMDA has police power? No. The MMDA cannot promulgate rules and regulation that would be implemented in the absence of a law. Because the law creating MMDA, Republic Act 79-24, according to the Supreme Court, that did not grant MMDA police power, let alone legislative power. So how does the MMDA implement the rules? Dapat mayroong ordinansa yung mga legislative bodies ng local governments of Metro Manila. Because Metro Manila is a peculiar region. This is the only region composed of cities and one municipality, Pateros, at wala pong probinsya. Ayan. But MMDA is not vested with police power. Can only implement the rules if the local government units in Metro Manila would enact legislative measures or ordinance for the implementation of a particular regulation. So kaya di ba, yung no vaccination, no movement, ay hindi magagawa ng MMDA yan in the absence of local ordinance. But if you want to challenge the local ordinance limiting the movement of people who are not vaccinated, you can go to court. Cite that case of Legazpi versus City of Cebu. Okay? Now, what about the power of eminent domain? It is based on Article 3, Section 9 of your Constitution. It is often referred to as expropriation with less frequency as condemnation. Those are synonymous terms. Okay? So according to Judge Leonen, in that case of Napocor versus Posada, the power of eminent domain is an inherent competence of the state. It is essential to sovereign. So if you are a sovereign, then you must have the power of eminent domain. It is also known as expropriation or condemnation, as what we have already discussed. Now, under the rules of court, particularly Rule 67, take note of remedial law kasi kapag ka-lawyer kayo at natalo, for example, o kahit na nanalo, hindi kayo papayag na gano'n na lang. You are looking for remedies. Diba? However, your remedies must be legal and within the bounds of law. That's why under ordinary times, remedial law constitutes 20% of the bar exam because as lawyers, we are always after remedies. Hindi ka sumusuko. So kaya kung gusto mo maging katulad ka namin, huwag ka rin sumuko. At ang number one dyan, huwag kang susuko sa bar. Kasi yan yung right of passage eh. Just go with the flow. Diba? Huwag sumurrender. Now, under Rule 67 of the Rules of Court, there are procedures for expropriation. First, condemnation, and then ascertainment of just compensation. At inulit din ito ni Justice Leonen, sabi niya 2 phases. One, determines the propriety of the action. Bakit naman yung lupa ko pa ang kukunin ng gobyerno? Ba't hindi na lang yung lupa ng kapitbahay ko? Diba? So pag di kayo nagkasundo, you go to court. And then, it was determined to be reasonable. Then, the next step is to determine just compensation. Diba? Ayan din yan. Now, if you cannot agree, you file a case in court. So may trial yan. And then during the pendency of the action, the state or the expropriator may already enter the private property para masimula na. Following the guidelines under Rule 67 na magdideposit o magbabayad ka ng 10% of the zonal value of the property. However, under Republic Act 8974, that is to facilitate the acquisition of right-of-way for national government project, it's not only 10% but 100% of the zonal value para ma-issuehan ka ng korte ng writ of possession so that the expropriator can start the expropriation process or the project itself. Okay? Now, who may exercise the power of eminent domain? Just like the police power, it is lodged in the legislature. Congress has that power. But it may be delegated, just like any other power, to the president, to the lawmaking bodies of the local government units, public corporations and quasi-public corporations. Okay? Now, local government units do not have inherent eminent domain power that is delegated by Congress, and under Republic Act 7160, the Local Government Code of 1991, local government units, known also as public corporations, have delegated power of eminent domain, but not inherent, delegated. What about quasi-public corporations? Sabi natin, pwede siyang i-delegate ng power of eminent domain. It is a private corporation, but it renders public service, supply public wants, or pursue other elementary objectives. Ano ba yan? For the common good, no? Oh. And nakikita ninyo, yung PLDT, Meralco, etc. They're private corporations owned by private individuals, yet because they are performing public functions, they supply public wants and render public service, they are known as quasi-public corporation, then they can be delegated with the power of eminent domain. Kaya nga dun sa Napocor versus Posadas, magtatayo ng substation yung Napocor, ay kailangan niyang gamitin yung private property, so expropriate niya yan. Lalo na ngayon, importante itong mga internet na ito. Kasi that's the number one problem of online classes, online lectures like this. Why? Ang problema kasi natin ngayon, yung mga internet providers natin, with all due respect, ay para mga jowa nyo lang, ang dalas nagloloko. Ano? Okay, sana naman hindi magloko. O sabi din natin, walang inherent power of eminent domain ng local government units. Diba? However, the local government units may expropriate based on the delegated power of eminent domain. Now, what are the requisites so that the LGUs may be allowed to exercise the power of eminent domain? There is an ordinance by the Sanggunian or Local Legislative Council that power is exercised for public use. Well, that is a constitutional provision. You pay just compensation, and you must have a valid indefinite offer given to the owner. However, may mga instances po na nagkakaroon ng local government units ng mga socialized housing. We'll discuss that. So tingnan ninyo yung mga inherent limitations. These are constitutional provisions. In that case of Plagcao versus Labra, yung ating Article 3 Section 1 at saka Article 3 Section 9. Okay? Now, sa socialized housing, medyo stricto. Kasi alam nyo bakit nagkakaroon ng socialized housing. Here comes a private property. Neglected or whatever happens, nakatiwangwang lang siya dyan. Then, ito yung mga enterprising informal settlers would be putting up their structures without permission from the real owner. At marami yung naniniwala na pag matagal na sila dyan, kahit hindi sila nagpaalam, they would have the right to occupy the property. Wrong! Bakit? Pag-aari ho ng iba yan at kinuha nyo, pag nanakaw yan, plain and simple. Diba? O, ibalik daw yung mga ninakaw, huwag yung magnanakaw. Yun ang nabasa ko. Okay? So, ang gagawin ngayon ng may-ari, gusto niyang bawiin yung kanyang private property. Akin yan eh. Diba? Kailan pa naging pwede sa ating sistema na yung hindi sa'yo, aangkinin mo. O di ba? Sa tunay na buhay man o sa pag-ibig, kayo mang aangkin ang hindi inyo. Okay. Gusto niyang bawiin. Ay, magrarally itong mga informal settlers as if they own the land. Don't get me wrong, I am nothing against them. Hindi kasalanan maging mahirap. Kaya lang, hindi tama at labag sa batas po yung papasukin nyo yung lupa na hindi sa inyo at aariin ninyo, hindi naman inyo yan, may nagmamay-ari niyan. O kaya lang, ayaw na nga. Yung may-ari, dahil may mga batas tayo dyan, particularly yung liberty of abode and right to travel, wala ko siyang right of liberty of abode dyan dahil hindi kanila yan. That's plain and simple. Simple logic will do. So yung may-ari, magpapile ng kaso. Ngayon, ang gagawin, i-relocate. Kung walang relocation site, ang sasabihin ng local government, bilhin ko na lang sa'yo. Plain and simple. Bilhin ko sa'yo. O, di ba? Tapos, i-distribute dun sa mga informal settlers. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, compliance with these conditions, yung 1 and 2, is mandatory because these are the only safeguards of oftentimes helpless owners of private property. Eh, kasalanan niya lang, iniwanan niya yung property niya na walang nagbabantay. Eh, minsan kasi pag pinabantayan mo, yung bantay pa ang nagkiklaim, di ba? Hirap talaga magtiwala ngayon. Kaya, totoo yan. Ha? Sabi ni Billy Joel, honesty is such a lonely word. Wala ng tapat ngayon, tanghali na lang ang tapat. Okay? At para mga Bluetooth lang yan. Pagkasama mo, connected. Pero pag tumalikod ka by searching for other devices na. So, when is there taking? Sabi ng Republic versus Castelby, the expropriator must enter the private property. The entry must be for more than a momentary. Dapat tumambay ka, huwag ka lang dadaan. And it must be under the color of authority. And then it should be devoted for public use. And you deprive the owner of the beneficial use of the property. Now, in the case of City of Manila versus Lagyo, yung City Council ng Maynila ay nag-issue ng ordinansa na pinapasara yung mga nightclubs, mga bars, etc. Ay di nag-file ng kaso yung mga owners ng mga establishments na ito. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, alam nyo, there are two kinds of taking. Possessory taking, when the government takes over the property, devoted to public use, pay the owner just compensation. And there is regulatory taking. Ano yung regulatory taking? The government does not take over the private property for public use, but imposes very strict regulation that deprives the owner of the property of the economically beneficial use of his property. Hindi niya naman pakinabangan because of a very strict legislation. Ha? Anong taking yun nasa picture dyan? I do not know kung anong klaseng taking yan. Ha? Now, socialized housing is qualified as public use. So kung yung lupa in-expropriate ng gobyerno para i-distribute doon sa mga homeless, ayan tayo, di ba? Kapag may problema, nag-create ng agency. So maraming walang bahay, yung iba marami ibinabahay. Ibang usapan yun. Okay? Ayan. Nag-create ng, Department of Housing. So may problema sa OFW, mayroon na tayo. Department of Migrant Workers. Bago lang yan. Now, in the exercise of the power of eminent domain, the burden of proof is on the expropriator. Ang trabaho lang ng may-ari ay i-oppose. Okay? Now, when it is expropriated, it must remain for public use. The change of use for as long as still public use, dating palengke, ginawang kalsada. Okay? Now, hindi ito po pwedeng i-convert into private use. Why? That will be subject to abuse. Nakukunin mo yung private property ko, kunyari gagamitin mo for public use, after some time, mga 10 years, ibebenta mo sa developer para gawin mong condominium. That's wrong. Di ba? That circumvents the rules. So, it must remain for public use, regardless of the change. Kasi minsan, ino-alter mo yung paggamit. For as long as still devoted to public use, there's no problem. Okay? And you pay the owner just compensation. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, it must be real, substantial, full, and fair. Now, how do you determine just compensation? That can be agreed upon by the seller and by the buyer even without judicial intervention. However, more often than not, they could not agree. Kasi pera-pera ho usapan dyan eh. Sa practice, alam nyo, napansin ko lang, kapag ka mayayaman, minsan hindi masyadong mayaman eh. Ang laro ay agawan lupa. Buti lang yung tatay ko, walang masyadong pinamanan lupa sa amin. Baka pag-awayan pa. Sabi ni Justice Leonen, the determination of just compensation in eminent domain cases is a judicial function. Diba? Ang trabaho ng executive department or the legislature is to make the initial determination. Okay? Based on the Bill of Rights, Article 3, Section 9. However, if you cannot agree, it is now the judicial function to determine how much is just compensation. Eh ano nga ba ang basihan? Ang basihan po mga kapatid at kapanalig sa panampalataya ay fair market value. Okay? What is fair market value? It is the price that the buyer is willing to buy your property and the seller is willing to sell. And kung di sila magkasundo, you go to court. Now, when is the proper time to determine the value of the land? Sabi ng Korte Suprema, based on Section 4 of Rule 67, it is the date of the taking or the filing of the case, whichever comes first. Okay? Yan din po yung kaso nung 2001. So wala naman tayong problema dyan. Either the date of the taking of the property or the filing of the complaint, whichever comes first. Ngayon, nung kinuha yung property mo, na-damage. May na-damage na kalahati lang gagamitin, pero hindi mo na magamit yung kalahati. So pabayaran mo na yung buo. Pero nagkaroon ng consequential benefits, i-minus natin yun. To be fair to the government or to the expropriator. And also observe due process. Okay? Due process is a constitutional right. Now, what about the power of taxation? Well, just like any other inherent power of the state, the purpose is revenue generation for the public good. The power of taxation is circumscribed by the inherent and constitutional limitations. Diba? Meron kayong lecture mamaya sa taxation law, hindi na ako mag-i-encroach dyan. But take note of the fact that tax laws are construed by the principle of strictissimi iuris against the taxpayer and in favor of the taxing authority. Who may exercise the power of taxation? Congress. But it can be delegated to the lawmaking bodies of the LGU, just like the other powers of the state. The President may also exercise delegated taxation power under the Constitution. Okay? And that was also the ruling of the court in 2011, di ba? That the power to tax is inherent in the state. But LGUs do not have inherent taxation power. Now, what is the purpose of taxation? Taxation is a tool to realize social justice. Why? Kasi ganito yan, parang Robin Hood, ano? Isipin nyo si Robin Hood kung totoo man yan. Kung hindi, bahala na. Kumukuha ka sa mayayaman para isubsidize mo yung mahirap. Yan yung purpose eh. Diba? Dami tuloy naging tamad. Sorry pero that's how I look at it. Bigyan mo ng livelihood, wag mong bigyan ng pera kasi mamay pansugal lang yan. Diba? Minsan sinasanla pa yung kanilang ATM. So an example of this is Republic Act 11228. Yung mga PWD na walang trabaho, natural, ito ay mga sektor na nasa laylayan ng lipunan. Parang kami mga lalaki, nasa laylayan na ng lipunan. Okay? Yung mga PWD na walang trabaho, automatic mayroong coverage ng PhilHealth. Sorry. Saan man gagaling? Doon sa mga syntaxes. Syntaxes. Yung sigarilyo, yung alak, tinaasan yung buwis, di ba? Yung malilikom doon, a certain portion goes to social benefits nitong mga PWD na walang trabaho. Kasi may trabaho, may panggagalingan ng contribution sa PhilHealth Pero yung mga PWD, amending the Magna Carta for the disabled persons, na wala naman talagang trabaho, manggagaling yung coverage ng PhilHealth nila doon sa syntaxes. That is the reason why taxation is a tool to realize social justice. Familiar kayo dito, di ba? At ayaw nyo that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, sabi ni Justice Marshall. That is the main ruling. Pero mas masarap kasing pakinggan that the power to tax is not the power to destroy. But that is a dissenting opinion of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Kailan pa natin sinunod ang dissenting opinion? Bawal yun. Mas masarap pakinggan Diba? Kung saan yung conveniente, doon tayo Now, take note of the inherent limitations on the power to tax. It must be for public purpose. It cannot be delegated unless authorized by law or the Constitution. Then the territoriality or situs of taxation, exemption of government from taxation, and international committee or reciprocity. Hindi committee Iba rin yung kumita. Okay. So taxes must always be for public purpose. And take note of the constitutional limitations under Article 6, particularly Section 28 and 29, and observe due process. in all the powers of the state, due process is necessary in their exercise. Okay? Double taxation is not necessarily forbidden. Double taxation becomes obnoxious only where the taxpayer is taxed twice. Hala, Korean yata ito. Ay, hindi. Mas gusto ko yung Blackpink. Bakit may ice cream? Diba? Sabi ng boyfriend sa girlfriend niya, ice cream ka ba? Bakit? Ang sweet mo sana pero nanlalamig ka na. So taxes are the lifeblood of the nation. Diba? Bakit siya lifeblood of the nation? Kasi kapag ka ang tao, tinanggalan mo ng dugo, patay na yan. So tanggalan mo ng taxes ang gobyerno, hindi na mag-ooperate yan. Ano pambabayad niya? Diba? Wala na. Okay? Tandaan yung mga inherent powers of the state. Ha? Now, puntahan natin yung the right to life, liberty, or property. Okay? Are these absolute rights? No. Because if you read the provision, Article 3, Section 1, they may be deprived. The requirement is observe due process. Now, what is the right to be alive? In that very comprehensive discussion, in the case of Secretary of Defense versus Manalo on the issue of writ of amparo, while the right to life under Article 3, Section 1 guarantees the right to be alive, upon which the government enjoyment of all other rights is precondition, kasama dyan yung right to security of person. Kasi what's the use of your life if you always feel insecure? So ano pa yung relasyon nyo kung di ka naman pala nagtitiwala? Love is nothing if you do not trust each one or each other. Diba? So the life to which each person has a right is not life lived in fear. Kasi buhay ka nga pero marami kang kinakatakutan na baka yung mga makapangyarihan ay lalabagin. O, diba? So walang kwenta yung right to be alive if that is the case. So right to life is nothing if there is no right to security of your person. Those rights may be deprived, however, if there is due process of law. Very common ito sa inyong lahat, ano? That due process of law is a law that hears before it condemns, proceeds upon inquiry, and renders judgment only after trial. Yan natural, yung mga misis at mga girlfriend, binabiolate yan eh. You are presumed guilty unless you can prove your innocence. Joke lang. Diba? So what are the elements of due process? Notice and hearing. That's why in the Philippines, dahil may due process tayo, walang bingin na pwedeng ikulong. No person can be imprisoned without hearing. O wag isasagot sa baryan. Okay. Now what about equal protection? All people who are similarly situated must be treated alike in terms of rights conferred and obligations required. Diba? Equal protection does not require universal application of laws to all people. But they must be treated similarly if they are similarly situated. And equal protection limits governmental discrimination. Kasi there should be no differential treatment if they are in the same situation or they belong to the same class. And equal protection extends even to artificial persons like your ABS-CBN. Okay, pag-usapan natin yung legislative franchise. Now, however, katulad din ng mga general rule, may exception yan. So there must be a valid classification based on substantial distinction. Applicable not only to existing conditions but to future conditions as well. It applies equally to all members of the same class and it is germane to the purpose of the law. So pwede ka magkaroon ng valid classification. Di ba? Para sa law school lang yan eh. Yung mga professor pwede mag-absent pero kayo bawal. Ay bakit? We are not equally situated. Okay? Kaya nga sabi ko sa mga estudyante ko, inside my classroom, you call me sir. Do not call me attorney. Outside my classroom, you can call me anything you want to call me. Just don't call me baby. Okay? Yung usapan yan. Kaya sa loob ng classroom, estudyante ko kayo. I am your professor. Outside, bahala na kayo. Tawagin niyo lang ako attorney kung kayo ay kliyente ko. But inside my classroom, that is forbidden. Now, is election to public office a reasonable classification? According to the court, no. Kasi itong si congressman, ay na-elect sa Kongreso. Pero merong pending case na inaapila niya, di ko nababanggitin yung kasong statutory rape. While the case was pending, he was elected and requested the Supreme Court that he be allowed to attend congressional sessions. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, anong kaibahan mo sa ordinaryong convicted person waiting for the appeal? Sabi niya, madi-deprive yung aking mga constituents of their local representation in Congress. Eh, they knew that, sabi ng Korte. Ibinoto ka nila, alam nila na may pending case ka, at any time po pwede kang ma-deprive ng liberty, and he was already deprived of liberty dahil may conviction na nga. Now, in terms of warrant, take note, 1904 pa ito, US versus Arceo. The inviolability of the home is one of the most fundamental of all the individual rights declared and recognized in the political codes of civilized nations. Kung sibilisado yung bansa mo, yung mga police and other authorities hindi mo papayagan na basta nalang papasok sa private homes without authority or without warrant. Di ba? No one can enter into the house of another without the consent of its owners or occupants. At kasama dyan, yung right to security of persons. Kasama dyan yung freedom from fear. Na baka mamaya, sino lang ang papasok sa bahay mo kahit walang otoridad. Ay, hindi po pwede yan. The right to security of person. And that includes bodily and psychological integrity and security. And third, guarantees protection of one's rights by the government. At hindi yung gobyerno ang unang lalabag sa karapatan mo. Diba? As such, kailangan ng warrant. Sino lang ba pwede mag-issue ng warrant? Napakaliwanag po ng Article 3, Section 2, only the judge. However, in the case of Salazar versus Atchacoso, the President may issue a warrant. Anong warrant ang pwedeng issue ng Presidente? So pwede na palang arestuhin. Ipa-aresto ng Presidente mga hindi bakunado? Hindi po. Yun lang mga illegal aliens for the purpose of their deportation. That is the only exception. Sabi ng Korte Suprema. Okay? So ano ang purpose ng garantiya sa Article 3, Section 2? The purpose of the constitutional provision is to prevent violation of private security in persons and property, an unlawful invasion of the security of the home by officers of the law acting under legislative or judicial sanction. Di ba? Hindi ka po pwedeng basta mang-aresto na lang dahil hindi niya dala yung kanyang vaccination card. Ang sayang nga nito, no? Kasi aaresto mo yung tao dahil hindi bakunado, tapos ikukulong mo. Di lalo siya na-infect doon sa dami ng tao doon. Di ba? Oh. Now, what are the requisites for the issuance of a valid warrant? Number one, there is probable cause. Usapan natin yan later. The presence of probable cause is personally determined by the judge. The complainant and the witnesses, he may produce or examine personally by the judge under oath or affirmation. Kasi baka mamaya nagsisinungaling. Napakarami sinungaling ngayon. The applicant and the witnesses testify on the facts known personally to them. Hindi po pwedeng sabi lang mo sa akin, so here is yan. Di ba? The warrant specifically describes the person and place to be searched and things to be seized. Kaya kailangan, particularly sino yung aarestuhin. Ay may mga crimes so tayo na yung assailant or yung akusado ay hindi kilala ng biktima. O magagalit, rape cases. Rape by stranger. Matapos yung crime, nasabihin ba ng biktima, hoy, sandali lang, anong pangalan mo kasi ididemanda kita. Ay, that is contrary to human experience. Kaya, pinapayagan ang mga John Doe warrant. Ba? John Doe, pag babae, Jane Doe. Kala ko ba yung Doe ay female deer? Bakit lalaki pala si Doe? O John Doe, o kaya Jane Doe. Diba? Dahil hindi mo kilala eh. So, ang kailangan lang natin as early as 1925, descriptio personae. Kaya idinidescribe mo, ano ba ang height niya? Ano yung range ng kanyang edad? At ginakartographic sketch naman ng ating mga cartographers. Kaya magkakapareho itsura ng mga suspect eh. Iisa lang yung artist eh. Diba? Siya tayong high-tech eh. Now, in order to issue the warrant, there must be probable cause. Ano ba yung probable cause? This means such reason supported by facts and circumstances as will warrant a cautious man in the belief that his actions and the means taken in prosecuting it are legally just and proper. In other words, based on opinion, ay baka siya ang gumawa. Okay? But take note, there are two instances when probable cause is determined in a criminal proceeding. One, in order for the fiscal to file the information in court. He cannot file an information in the absence of probable cause. Well, now, when the information is already filed, the judge has to determine probable cause in order to issue or not a warrant for the arrest of the person. That is the reason why, according to the court, Arroyo v. Sandiganbayan, you do not need to file a petition for or motion for judicial determination of probable cause because that is an inherent duty of the judge. When the judge determines probable cause, he will issue a warrant. But if the judge did not see any probable cause, no warrant is issued. And a person cannot be arrested in the absence of a warrant. Your property cannot be searched without a warrant. Why? Based on the doctrine of the fruit of the poisonous tree. Hindi ho akin yung picture. Ano? At hindi naman siguro poisonous fruit yan. What is the poisonous tree? In the Bible, ang sabi, a good tree cannot bring forth bad fruits. Neither could a bad tree bring forth good fruits. So you shall know them by their fruits. The poisonous tree is the illegal means of securing the evidence, while the poisonous fruit is the evidence secured through illegal means. That's why inadmissible. Yan ang sinasabi dun sa Article 3, Section 2, di ba? Any evidence obtained in violation of this or the preceding section referring to Section 2 shall be inadmissible for any purpose in any proceeding. Why? Based on that doctrine. Actually, parang ginaya lang natin ito dun sa Blackstone's formulation. One of my favorite jurists ay itong si William Blackstone. Sabi niya, better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. Diba? Okay na, napalayain mo yung 10 guilty. Pero yung magkukulong ka ng isang inosente, that is too much. Kasi one day in jail, even for those who are guilty, is too much suffering, lalo na sa mga jails natin. How much more for a person who is not guilty of the crime? The end does not justify the means. We are in a democracy. We are not in a Machiavellian society. Diba? Pagka susundin mo si Niccolo Machiavelli doon sa kanyang libros, The Prince, okay lang eh. Sabi niya pa nga, it's better to be feared than to be loved. Yan ang ginagamit ng mga diktador eh. But we are not like that. The end does not justify the means. You cannot sacrifice civil liberty in the altar of law or peace and order according to the court. Okay? So there are, however, arrests without warrant allowed by our laws and jurisprudence. Arrest in flagrante delicto, hot pursuit, then arrest of escapee. Now, if you are objecting to the warrantless arrest, you have to do that before the accused enters his plea. Otherwise, the right to question the legality of the warrantless arrest is waived. Okay? Now, in the case of Miranda versus People, written by your chairman, the accused failure to object to the legality of their arrest or to the absence of a preliminary investigation before entering their plea will not negate their conviction when it is duly proven by the prosecution na guilty sila. Sinasabi lang, you have to contest, you have to object to the warrantless arrest before you enter your plea if you are the accused. However, the filing of bail or posting of bail is not considered a waiver of your right to question the legality of the warrantless arrest. Okay? Now, in hot pursuit arrest, you have to remember that the arresting officers did not actually witness the commission of the crime, unlike in flagrante delicto arrest. That is why there are elements that you have to comply with in order to have a valid hot pursuit arrest. One, the offense has just been committed. Second, the arresting officer has probable cause. Hindi personal knowledge, has probable cause based on personal knowledge of facts and circumstances. Because they did not actually see the crime being committed. Otherwise, hindi na hot pursuit yan na ay flagrante delicto arrest. Now, what are the consequences of an invalid arrest? The court will not acquire jurisdiction over the person of the accused. And under our Constitution and our laws, criminal liability of law enforcers for illegal arrest. Kaya hindi ho yata nasasabihan yung ating mga kaibigan mga pulis na pag nang-aresto kayo ng illegal ay may pananagutan kayo sa batas. And any search incident to that arrest shall become invalid. Because according to the court, People versus Chua Ho San, the warrantless arrest must be preceded, must come first before a search incidental to a valid arrest. Hindi po pwedeng mag-search ka muna bago ka mang-aresto. Hindi po pwede kung wala kang warrant. Okay? Now, ito na yung sinasabi natin na pag hindi nyo challenge yan, it is deemed waived. So nauso na naman yung mga checkpoint. Ano ba ang general rule? Checkpoints are anathema to a democracy. Pagka-demokrasya, wala dapat checkpoint. However, according to the court, hindi lahat ng checkpoints ay illegal. There are legal checkpoints. For as long as the vehicle is neither searched nor the occupant subjected to a body search, hindi kayo pwedeng pababain. Diba? At visual search lang ang gagawin. Hindi pwedeng pabuksan ng anumang bahagi ng inyong sasakyan. And take note, huwag kayong papayag hanggat wala silang warrant. Otherwise, pag pumayag kayo, you can no longer question the validity of that search. Why? Ang sasabihin ng mga nag-search sa inyo, consented search. Dahil ang gusto ng korte dyan, less intrusive. At yung mga nagmaman ng checkpoint ay naka-uniforme. At well-lighted. At may previous notice na may checkpoint dyan. Okay? We understand the desire of our law enforcers to enforce the law. But please enforce the law without violating the Constitution and the laws. Kasama na dyan yung privacy of communication na wala dapat nakikialam. But when you enter into a contract of marriage, do you surrender your right to privacy of communication? The court said, no. Even if you are married, your spouse cannot intrude in your private communication. Diba? At yan, dinidiscuss sa misis ko. Kaya lang, to be sure, meron tayong legal na cellphone, meron tayong extra legal, at meron tayong reserva. Hirap matsyempohan. Ano? Joke lang naman yan. Now, what about the right to privacy? The right to privacy is one of the most threatened rights of men living in a mass society. Saan ba nanggagaling yung mga takot? Yung mga banta from the government, journalist, employer, pag nag-apply ka ng trabaho, social scientist. Di ba? Kaya hindi po pwedeng labagin ito. And in terms of right or freedom of speech and expression, take note that the Supreme Court adopts the clear and present danger rule in order to determine whether or not the limitation on the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press is legal. Okay? And take note also that any form of prior restraint is unconstitutional. Pabayaan mo muna siyang mag-exercise niyan. Otherwise, censorship yan. And censorship is inimical to a democracy. So the government carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the enforcement on restraint on your freedom of communication, of freedom of speech, expression, and of the press. Now, we also have the right to public assembly, but that is not absolute. Diba? Hindi ka lang pwedeng magsisigaw dyan sa kalsada at sabihin mo, ito ay freedom to public assembly. We have a law on that. Batas Pambansa bilang 880. Kasama na yan yung permit, etc. Diba? So kasi naman, we are a government of laws and not of men. Your rights have limitations. There is no such thing as absolute right. Okay? At napakahalaga po sa mga panahong ito, yung Miranda Rights. It was derived from the case of Miranda versus Arizona. Yan po si Ernesto Miranda, nakikita nyo sa screen ninyo. Inaresto dahil nagnakaw daw ng $8 sa bangko, napaamin at sinabi niya na nan-rape din siya ng isang 18-year-old pero walang abogado na nagtumulong sa kanya during custodial investigation. So, in-integrate na natin ito sa ating batas, Article 3, Section 12, Paragraph 1, that any person under investigation for the commission of an offense shall have the right to be informed of his right to remain silent, to have a competent independent counsel, preferably of his own choice. If he cannot afford one, he shall be provided with one. These rights cannot be waived except in writing and in the presence of counsel. Ba't ba napakahalaga ng abogado dyan? Kasi po sabi ng Korte Suprema, even lawyers somehow get lost in the myriad of procedures. How much more a person is not initiated in the language of the law? He might be convicted not because he's guilty, but because he does not know how to establish his innocence. Diba? So ano ba yung tinatawag na custodial investigation? Ito yung process of inviting a person. Yan ba ay pag inimbita ka, ito ba ay bibigyan ka ng cake dyan o pakakainin ka ng ice cream? Hindi po. So, invitation to a person under investigation is already considered custodial investigation. Kailangan mo na dyan na i-invoke ang Miranda Rights. Diba? Oh, what about police line-up? Sabi ng Korte Suprema, People versus Pipino, police line-up is not part of custodial investigation. Therefore, hindi ka pwedeng humingi ng abogado dyan pag nasama ka sa police line-up. Okay? But, the Miranda Doctrine requires that any person under investigation shall have the right to remain silent. Dapat i-inform, hindi lang yung right to remain silent, but the right to be informed that he has the right to remain silent because anything he says shall be and will be used against him. Diba? Napanood kayo ng mga pelikula o usong-usong Netflix, FBI, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say shall be and will be used against you in the courts of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, you'll be given one. Sabi nung sa Pilipinas, pag inaresto ang isang tao, binubugbog ng taong bayan. Ano pa ang silbi ng mga law enforcer? Kung papayagan nyo na bugbugin yung tao. Remember, presumption of innocence. Diba? Wala pang conviction. Only the court can tell you whether or not that person accused of committing a crime is guilty or not. Trabaho ng korte yan. Hindi natin trabaho, hindi trabaho ng pulis yan. Now, when do you invoke the Miranda Rights? You can invoke that when you are taken into custody for investigation. The moment you are taken into custody para sa custodial investigation, you can now invoke Miranda Rights. Well, you can waive under Article 3, Section 12. Diba? These rights cannot be waived except in the presence of counsel in writing. Ba't kailangan din yung abogado? Para mapayuhan ka about the consequences of what you are doing. Okay? Kasi ang mga abogado, inaral yan. Kami ang nag-aral ng batas. Kaya nga kayo gusto nyo rin maging abogado, di ba? Para inaral nyo na rin yung batas Ang kaibahan lang yung pagpasasabar. O kaya kung gusto nyo matinong relasyon, asawa man yan, boyfriend or girlfriend, manong kinabogado. Matino ang relasyon dyan. Bakit? Yung batas nga, inuunawa. Ikaw pa kaya? Di ba? Yung mga pinaglalaban, ikaw pa ba naman? Pero sabi niya si Leonen, bar muna bago jowa. Naku, sabi ng iba mag-aasawa na po ako, ang tagal ng bar.